Picture this. A man stands before the most powerful king on earth. His hands tremble, sweat drips down his face. He knows that with a single word the King of Kings could have him impaled, flayed alive, or buried up to his neck in the desert sun to die screaming over days. But this man, Aristagoras of Miletus, is already a dead man walking. He has gambled everything on a military expedition that has catastrophically failed. He owes the Persian Empire a fortune he cannot repay, and now he must make the most dangerous decision of his life. He will betray the largest empire the world has ever seen. This single act of desperation will ignite a firestorm that consumes cities, drowns thousands in blood-soaked seas, and sets in motion a chain of events that will bring two civilizations into a death struggle lasting decades. The burning of Sardis will echo through history. The massacre at Lade will stain the Aegean red. And when Persian wrath finally descends upon the Greek world, it will come with a fury that threatens to extinguish Western civilization before it even begins. This is the story of the Ionian Revolt, the war that nobody wanted, the rebellion that everyone lost, the spark that ignited the flames of the greatest conflict of the ancient world. This is where it all began. This is the brutal truth of how one man's ambition and cowardice plunged an entire region into fire, blood, and ultimate annihilation. Welcome to the war before the war. Welcome to the catastrophe that made the Persian invasions of Greece inevitable. Welcome to the Ionian Revolt. Brothers and sisters, I'm going to be honest. YouTube's algorithm is crushing small channels that don't get engagement, but you have the power to change that. Every time you hit that like button, leave a comment, share this video, and turn on all notifications. You're voting for this content to reach millions more people. So engage right now. Like this video. Comment Ionian Revolt if you're ready for this epic story. Subscribe with notifications on so you don't miss a single upload. Share this with someone who loves real history. You are this channel's power. Now let's dive into the brutal truth of the Ionian Revolt. To understand why the Ionian Revolt exploded with such devastating force, you need to understand the world that created it. A world where Greek cities bowed to Persian masters. A world of tyrants, tribute, and simmering resentment. A world balanced on a knife's edge, waiting for one desperate man to push it over into chaos. The year is 499 BC. The Achaemenid Persian Empire dominates the known world. From the mountains of Afghanistan to the deserts of Egypt, from the steppes of Central Asia to the shores of the Aegean Sea, the great King Darius I rules over millions with absolute authority. This is not merely an empire. This is a machine of conquest, administration, and overwhelming military might. The Persians have crushed every enemy who dared oppose them. They have subjugated nations, obliterated armies, and systematically expanded their dominion with ruthless efficiency. But empires built on conquest are never truly stable. They require constant management, constant pressure, constant fear to keep conquered peoples in line. And nowhere is this more apparent than in Ionia, the Greek-populated western coast of Asia Minor, what we now call Turkey. The Ionian Greeks are living under an arrangement that breeds resentment and rage. Decades earlier, the Persian military juggernaut rolled through Ionia, bringing these wealthy, proud Greek city-states under Persian control. But the Persians, pragmatic rulers that they are, did not govern these cities directly. Instead, they installed local Greek tyrants, puppet rulers who owed their power entirely to Persian backing. These tyrants collected tribute, enforced Persian policy, and maintained order on behalf of their foreign masters. In return, they enjoyed wealth, power, and protection from the largest military force on earth. For the common people of Ionia, This system was unbearable. The Greek world treasured concepts of freedom, autonomy, and citizen participation in government. Many Greek city-states were experimenting with democracy or oligarchy, forms of government where at least some citizens had a voice. But in Persian-controlled Ionia, the people had no voice. They were ruled by tyrants who answered not to them, but to Persian satraps, provincial governors who enforced the great king's will with brutal efficiency. The satrap of Lydia, the Persian province containing most of Ionia, was a man named Artaphernes. His capital was Sardis, an ancient city of legendary wealth located inland from the Ionian coast. Artaphernes was the brother of King Darius himself, which tells you everything about how important the Persians considered this region. He was no mere administrator. He was a member of the royal family, a man who wielded the power of a life and death over millions, a man who could call upon the limitless resources of the Persian military machine if the Greeks ever stepped out of line. Among the puppet tyrants serving under Artaphernes was Histiaeus of Miletus. Histiaeus ruled the most powerful of the Ionian cities, Miletus, a wealthy trading centre and naval power. Histiaeus had earned his position through loyalty to Darius. Years earlier, during a disastrous Persian military campaign against the Scythian nomads far to the north, Histiaeus had saved Darius's army by guarding a critical bridge across the Danube River. When other Greek tyrants counselled destroying the bridge and abandoning the Persian king to his fate, Histiaeus remained loyal. Darius rewarded this loyalty with power, wealth, and favour. But Darius was no fool. He understood that Histiaeus was too ambitious, too capable, too dangerous to leave unsupervised in Ionia. So the king used a diplomatic fiction. He summoned Histiaeus to Susa, the Persian capital, ostensibly as an honoured advisor. In reality, Histiaeus was a hostage, a golden prisoner kept far from his power base to prevent any thoughts of rebellion. Comfortable? Yes. Wealthy? Absolutely. But trapped nonetheless, watching his former domain from 1,000 miles away, unable to exercise real power. In Histiaeus' absence, Miletus was governed by his son-in-law, Aristagoras. And Aristagoras was a very different man from his cautious, calculating father-in-law. Aristagoras was ambitious, reckless, and desperately eager to prove himself. He was not content to simply manage Miletus and collect tribute for his Persian masters. He wanted glory. He wanted conquest. He wanted to be remembered as a great leader, not a Persian puppet. And so Aristagoras hatched a plan that would doom him, doom his city, and plunge the entire Greek world into decades of savage warfare. The island of Naxos in the heart of the Aegean Sea was wealthy and powerful, but it was also in turmoil. A group of exiled aristocrats from Naxos approached Aristagoras with a proposal. "Help us return to power," they said. "Give us military support to overthrow the current government, and we will make sure Naxos becomes a Persian client state, paying tribute and providing ships for future Persian operations." It was an opportunity too tempting for Aristagoras to resist. But Aristagoras did not have the military resources for such an expedition. So he went to Artaphernes in Sardis with his proposal. Artaphernes saw the strategic value. Naxos would be a stepping stone for Persian expansion into the Aegean, potentially opening the route to conquer more Greek islands and even threaten mainland Greece itself. Artaphernes took the proposal to King Darius, who approved it enthusiastically. The Persians assembled a massive fleet of 200 warships and thousands of soldiers. The cost was astronomical, and Aristagoras, as the initiator of this scheme, was personally responsible for making it succeed. The expedition was a catastrophe. Someone, perhaps one of the Persian commanders who resented taking orders from a Greek tyrant, warned the Naxians of the coming attack. When the Persian fleet arrived, instead of finding an unsuspecting island ripe for conquest, they found walls manned, defences prepared, and a population ready to resist to the death. The Persians laid siege for 4 months, burning through their supplies and their budget, but the Naxians refused to yield. Finally, broke and humiliated, the expedition limped back to Ionian waters, having accomplished nothing. For Aristagoras, this was a death sentence. He had promised Artaphernes a quick, profitable conquest. Instead, he had delivered an expensive, embarrassing failure. He owed the Persian treasury a fortune he could never repay. He had lost the confidence of his Persian masters. Artaphernes would certainly strip him of his power. Darius might demand far harsher punishment. Everything Aristagoras had worked for was about to come crashing down. And in that moment of desperate fear, Aristagoras made his choice. If he was going to fall, he would burn everything down with him, he would rebel, and he would drag all of Ionia into the flames. Aristagoras knew he was a dead man. The Naxos expedition had drained Persian coffers and delivered nothing but humiliation. Artaphernes would demand an accounting. The great king himself would hear of this failure, and when powerful men are embarrassed, someone must pay the price in blood. Everything pointed to Aristagoras being that someone. His position, his wealth, his life, all hung by the thinnest of threads, ready to be severed by a Persian executioner's blade. But desperation breeds dangerous clarity. If Aristagoras was going to fall, why fall alone? Why not burn the entire system down? Why not transform his personal catastrophe into something far larger, something that could reshape the political landscape of the entire Aegean world? The tyrant of Miletus began to consider the unthinkable, rebellion. Not just his own rebellion, but a coordinated uprising of every Ionian city simultaneously. A revolt so massive that the Persians would be forced to respond with their full military might, giving Aristagoras time to seek help from mainland Greece, and perhaps, just perhaps, survive. The historical record suggests that Aristagoras did not act entirely alone in conceiving this conspiracy. Far away in Susa, his father-in-law Histiaeus was still trapped in golden captivity, still watching his former domain from 1,000 miles away with bitter eyes. Histiaeus sent a secret message to Aristagoras, a message so sensitive that the messenger's head was shaved, the instructions tattooed onto his scalp, and the hair allowed to grow back before he was dispatched to Miletus. When Aristagoras received this human letter and shaved the messenger's head, he found encouragement for a revolt. Whether Histiaeus genuinely believed rebellion could succeed, or whether he simply saw an opportunity to create chaos that might allow his return to Ionia, remains debated by historians. What matters is that Aristagoras now had validation from the one man whose opinion carried weight in Miletus. The conspiracy was real. Aristagoras called a meeting of his trusted advisors and military commanders. He laid out the situation with brutal honesty. The Naxos disaster had doomed him. Persian punishment was inevitable, but he proposed something audacious. They would not wait for punishment. They would strike first. They would overthrow not just their own tyranny, but every Persian-backed tyrant throughout Ionia. They would proclaim democracy, give the people a voice they had been denied for decades, and turn this entire region into a bonfire of rebellion that would force Persia to fight on Ionian terms. One man at that meeting urged caution. Herodotus, a renowned geographer and intellectual, understood the sheer scale of Persian power better than most. He had travelled extensively, studied the empire's resources, and grasped the horrifying arithmetic of what rebellion meant. He argued passionately against revolt. The Persians commanded resources beyond, comprehension. They could field armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands. They controlled territories from India to Egypt. They had crushed every rebellion they had ever faced with overwhelming force. Hecataeus urged Aristagoras to seek reconciliation, to beg forgiveness, to do anything except provoke the sleeping dragon of Persian military might. But Aristagoras had already made his choice. Fear is a powerful motivator, and he feared certain death more than he feared probable death. He rejected Hecataeus's counsel and set his plan in motion. The first step was dramatic and calculated to win popular support. Aristagoras publicly resigned his position as tyrant of Miletus. He announced the establishment of democracy, giving Milesian citizens the right to elect their own leaders and participate in government. This was not mere political theatre, it was psychological warfare. For decades, Ionians had resented their puppet rulers. Now, suddenly the tyrant himself was overthrowing tyranny. The response was electric. Aristagoras moved quickly before the Persians could react. He had seized several of the other Ionian tyrants who'd been aboard the ships during the Naxos expedition. These men, his fellow puppets in the Persian system, were now liabilities and opportunities. He handed them over to their own cities, telling the citizens to do with them as they pleased. Most were simply expelled, sent into exile. But one, Coas of Mytilene, was not so fortunate. The people of Mytilene, their rage finally given an outlet, stoned their former tyrant to death in the streets. It was a message written in blood. The old order was dead. The rebellion had begun. Within weeks, tyrannies across Ionia collapsed like dominoes. City after city rose up, overthrew their Persian-backed rulers, and established democratic governments. Miletus, Ephesus, Myos, Priene, Chios, Samos, Lesbos. The list grew longer by the day. What had been a stable, if resentful, Persian province was now a revolutionary tinderbox. Aristagoras had gambled everything on one desperate throw of the dice, and the dice had come up in his favour. For now. But Aristagoras understood the brutal reality behind his initial success. The Ionians, even united, could not defeat the Persian Empire alone. They needed allies. They needed ships, soldiers, and resources from beyond Ionia. They needed mainland Greece to join the fight. Without that support, this rebellion would be nothing more than a brief spasm of defiance before Persian armies crushed it into dust. And so Aristagoras prepared for the most important diplomatic mission of his life. He would travel to Greece and plead for help. He would beg the greatest military powers of the Greek world to send forces to aid Ionia's desperate bid for freedom. His first destination was Sparta. The Spartans possessed the most fearsome land army in Greece, a professional warrior class trained from childhood for nothing but war. If anyone could stand against Persian infantry, it was the Spartans. Aristagoras arrived in Sparta with gifts, with arguments, and with a secret weapon. He brought a bronze map, possibly borrowed from Hecataeus himself, showing the entire Persian Empire, all its territories, rivers, and cities engraved in metal. This map was meant to demonstrate both the wealth available for plunder and the feasibility of striking at the heart of Persian power. Aristagoras met with King Cleomenes thus and made his pitch. He praised Spartan military prowess, called them the finest warriors in the world, and argued that conquering Persia would be surprisingly easy. The Persians, he claimed, fought in trousers and turbans, implying they were soft, civilized, and unaccustomed to facing real soldiers. He spoke of unimaginable riches, gold and silver beyond measure, treasures that would make whoever controlled Persia the wealthiest state in the world. He painted a picture of easy conquest and limitless reward. Cleomenes asked for 2 days to consider the proposal. When they met again, the Spartan king asked a single, devastating question. How long would it take to march from the coast to Susa, the Persian capital? Aristagoras, perhaps caught off guard by the directness of the question, answered honestly. 3 months. 3 months of marching through hostile territory deep into the heart of an empire that could raise armies at every stage of the journey. Cleomenes refused immediately. The Spartans would not send their army on a campaign that would take them 3 months from the sea, 3 months from their supply lines, 3 months into the unknown depths of a hostile empire. Aristagoras tried to salvage the situation. He allegedly offered Cleomenes 10 talents of silver, a fortune to reconsider. When that failed, he increased the offer to 50 talents. Cleomenes' young daughter, Gorgo, present at the meeting, reportedly told her father to leave before the stranger corrupted him with bribes. Whether this charming anecdote is true or invented by later writers, the result was the same. Cleomenes rejected the appeal. Sparta would not help Ionia. Aristagoras left Sparta empty-handed, his greatest hope crushed. But Aristagoras did not give up. He travelled next to Athens, the rising naval power of mainland Greece. Athens was different from Sparta in crucial ways. It was a democracy, governed by an assembly of citizens rather than by kings. It had a large fleet, exactly what the Ionian Revolt needed most. And Athens had its own reasons to resent Persia. The Athenians had recently expelled their own tyrant, Hippias, who had fled to the Persian court seeking support for his restoration. The Persians had sheltered this hated exile, and had even sent envoys to Athens demanding that they take Hippias back. Athens had refused, and tensions between Athens and Persia were already simmering. Aristagoras made his case to the Athenian assembly. He emphasized that Miletus was originally an Athenian colony, reminding them of ancient kinship ties. He painted vivid pictures of Ionian Greeks suffering under Persian tyranny. He spoke of the wealth and resources of Ionia, now governed by democracies just like Athens itself. And he made the threat explicit. If Persia crushed the Ionian Revolt, they would turn their attention to mainland Greece next. Better to fight them in Ionia, on Ionian terms, than to wait for Persian armies to cross the Aegean and threaten Athens directly. The Athenian assembly debated and voted. To Aristagoras' immense relief, they agreed to help. Athens would send 20 warships to support the Ionian cause. It was not a massive force, but it was something. It was validation. It was hope. And when the nearby city of Eretria on the island of Euboea heard that Athens was joining the revolt, they pledged 5 more ships. 25 Greek warships from mainland cities would sail to Ionia and join the rebellion against Persia. The ancient historian Herodotus would later write that this decision was the beginning of all the troubles between Greeks and Persians. Those 20 ships from Athens, he claimed, were the cause of every disaster that followed. It is easy, with hindsight, to see the Athenian vote as catastrophically foolish. But in the moment, in 498 BC, it must have seemed justified. The Ionians were fellow Greeks, kinsmen, fighting for freedom against foreign tyranny. How could Athens refuse to help? How could they stand by while Greek cities burned under Persian occupation? The decision was made with good intentions, with democratic idealism, and with a fundamental misunderstanding of just how savagely the Persian Empire responded to rebellion. By the spring of 498 BC, the pieces were in place. Ionia was in open revolt. Democratic governments had replaced Persian-backed tyrants throughout the region. Athenian and Eretrian ships had arrived and joined the rebel fleet. The Ionians had momentum, they had unity, and they had hope. Now they needed a military victory, something dramatic that would prove the rebellion was serious, that would inspire others to join, and that would demonstrate to the world that Persia could be challenged successfully. Aristagoras and his generals planned their strike. They would attack the symbol of Persian power in the region. They would march on Sardis, the capital of the satrapy, the city where Artaphernes ruled in the great king's name. They would bring the war directly to Persia's doorstep. They would light a fire that would be seen across the empire. They had no idea just how literally that fire would burn, or just how terrible the consequences would be. Spring came to the Aegean in 498 BC with unusual promise. The air was electric with revolutionary fervour. Across Ionia, newly established democracies buzzed with activity. Citizens who had lived under tyranny for decades now participated in assemblies, elected generals, and made decisions about their own futures. But everyone understood that this freedom was temporary unless they could prove their strength. They needed a victory, something dramatic that would announce to the world that the rebellion was serious, that would inspire others to join the cause, and that would demonstrate the Ionians could strike at the heart of Persian power and survive. The Athenian fleet arrived as promised, 20 sleek triremes cutting through the waves toward Ionian waters. Each ship carried approximately 200 men, including rowers, marines, and officers. These were not professional soldiers like the Spartans, they were Athenian citizens, farmers and craftsmen who took up arms when their city called. But they were motivated, well-trained, and sailing to war with the confidence of men representing one of the most powerful democracies in Greece. 5 more ships from Eretria joined them, smaller but equally committed to the cause. 25 warships represented thousands of fighting men, substantial reinforcement for the rebel forces. The combined Greek army assembled near Ephesus, one of the great cities of Ionia. Aristagoras, despite orchestrating this entire rebellion, declined to personally lead the expedition. Perhaps he recognized his limitations as a military commander. Perhaps he feared what would happen if he were captured or killed far from Miletus. Or perhaps, as some ancient sources suggest, he was simply a coward who preferred others to take the risks his ambition had created. Whatever the reason, he appointed his brother Carapenus and another Milesian commander named Hermophantus to lead the expedition. These men would command thousands of hoplites, heavily armoured Greek infantry, plus light troops, archers and support personnel. The exact size of this force is unknown, but it was substantial enough to threaten a major Persian stronghold. The target was Sardis, the ancient capital of Lydia, conquered by Persia decades earlier and now serving as the administrative centre for the entire western satrapy. Artaphernes, half-brother to King Darius himself, ruled from Sardis. The city represented everything the Ionians hated about Persian occupation. It was where tribute was collected, where orders were issued, where Persian military power in the region was concentrated. If the rebels could capture Sardis, even temporarily, it would be a propaganda victory beyond measure. It would prove that Persia could be hurt. It would demonstrate that the rebellion was not a minor disturbance but a genuine military threat. The Greeks marched inland from Ephesus, following local guides who knew the mountain paths. This was enemy territory, or at least contested territory, and the army moved with caution. But remarkably, they encountered no resistance. Either the Persians were caught completely off guard, or they had simply underestimated how quickly and boldly the Greeks would move. Day after day, the rebel army marched deeper into the interior of Asia Minor, climbing through mountain passes, following river valleys, moving ever closer to their target. The soldiers must have felt a mixture of excitement and terror. They were about to attack one of the most important cities in the Persian Empire. Success would make them heroes. Failure would likely mean death or slavery. Sardis appeared before them like a vision from another world. The city sprawled across the landscape, its lower towns spreading out below the imposing acropolis that dominated the surrounding terrain. That citadel, perched on a steep rocky hill, was considered virtually impregnable. Ancient Lydian kings had built those fortifications generations ago, and the Persians had maintained and strengthened them. From those heights, defenders could rain arrows and stones down on any attacking force while remaining safe behind massive walls. The Greeks looked up at that fortress and understood they had no chance of taking it by direct assault. But they had not come to besiege the citadel. They had come to capture the city itself and strike a blow that would echo across the empire. The attack came swiftly. The Greeks descended on Sardis with shocking speed, pouring into the lower city before organised resistance could form. The Persian garrison was small, concentrated mostly in the citadel. The civilian population, a mixture of Lydians, Persians, and other ethnic groups, found themselves suddenly in the middle of a battlefield. Artaphornes, realizing he could not hold the entire city, made the only sensible military decision. He withdrew his forces to the Acropolis, abandoning the lower town to its fate. The Greeks flooded through the streets of Sardis. They had won. They had actually captured a Persian provincial capital. The lower city was theirs, filled with homes, shops, temples, and warehouses. This should have been the moment of triumphant plunder, when soldiers enriched themselves with the spoils of war. But something went catastrophically wrong. A fire started. Herodotus, our primary source for these events, suggests it was accidental, that a Greek soldier set fire to a house, and the flames spread uncontrollably. But many modern historians suspect arson, deliberate destruction meant to terrorize the Persians, or perhaps simply the chaos of undisciplined soldiers running wild in a conquered city. Whatever its origin, the fire became an unstoppable monster. Sardis was built largely of materials that burned readily, wooden structures with thatched roofs made from reeds and straw. These were not the stone buildings of later periods. They were highly combustible constructions that transformed into towering infernos within minutes of catching flame. The fire leaped from house to house, carried by wind and fed by the dense urban environment where buildings pressed close together. What started as a single blaze became a conflagration that consumed entire neighbourhoods. The civilian population of Sardis faced a nightmarish choice: stay in their homes and burn to death, or flee into streets that might themselves be rivers of fire. Thousands chose to run, and they all ran in the same direction, toward the river Pactolus. This river, famous in legend as the source of King Croesus's gold, ran through the heart of Sardis, including through the central marketplace, the Agora. It represented water, safety, a barrier against the flames. The population converged on the riverbanks in a desperate flood of humanity. But the marketplace was also where the Persian garrison from the citadel had taken refuge. Surrounded by flames, unable to remain in the Acropolis, which was itself threatened by the spreading fire, the Persian soldiers had descended into the Agora. Now they found themselves packed into a confined space with the terrified civilian population, and in that chaos military discipline somehow held. These were professional Persian soldiers, perhaps members of the elite units that formed the backbone of the imperial army. They understood that panic meant death. They formed ranks in the marketplace, shields locked, spears levelled, and prepared to fight their way out. The Greeks, who moments before had been celebrating their victory, suddenly found themselves facing an organized enemy in the heart of a burning city. The Persians attacked with the desperation of men who had nothing to lose, fighting in the marketplace of Sardis, surrounded by flames and smoke, with civilians screaming and fleeing in every direction. The Persians drove the Greeks back. This was not a great tactical victory. It was raw survival, soldiers fighting with their backs literally to a wall of fire. But it was enough. The Greeks, demoralized by the chaos, exhausted from their march, and now facing determined resistance, began to retreat. The withdrawal turned into a rout. Greek commanders shouted orders to pull back, to regroup, to get out of the burning city before they were trapped and incinerated. The soldiers, many of whom had never experienced combat before, broke ranks and fled. The great victory had turned into a disaster in the span of hours. Sardis was burning, but the Greeks had failed to hold it, failed to capture Artaphernes, failed to secure any meaningful plunder. All they had accomplished was destruction. And among the buildings consumed by the flames was the temple of Cybele. This shrine to the Phrygian mother goddess, adopted and revered by the Persians, was an ancient and sacred site. Its destruction was more than a military or economic blow. It was a religious catastrophe, an act that the Persians would interpret as deliberate sacrilege. The Greeks had burned a temple, violated sacred ground, and committed an atrocity that demanded vengeance. The rebel army retreated from Sardis and began the long march back toward the coast and the relative safety of the Ionian cities. They moved quickly, trying to put distance between themselves and the burning capital, but they were not moving quickly enough. From the mountains of Tmolus overlooking Sardis, they could see the flames rising into the night sky, a pillar of smoke visible for miles. The city they had briefly held was now a crematorium. Thousands of civilians had likely perished in the inferno. The economic heart of the satrapy was reduced to ash and rubble, and the consequences of this catastrophe were already in motion. News travelled fast in the Persian Empire. A sophisticated network of royal roads, courier stations, and relay riders could carry messages across vast distances with remarkable speed. When word reached Susa that Sardis had been attacked and burned, that Greek rebels had dared to strike at a provincial capital, that a sacred temple had been destroyed, the response was swift and terrible. King Darius thus sat upon his throne in the palace of Susa, centre of the largest empire the world had ever seen. He was not merely a king, he was the Shahanshah, the king of kings, the supreme ruler whose word was law from the Indus to the Aegean. He had crushed rebellions from Egypt to Central Asia. He had reorganized the empire into efficient satrapies, built roads, codified laws, and projected Persian power across 3 continents. And now, a handful of Greek cities, insignificant backwaters on the western edge of his domain, had dared to rebel. Worse, Greeks from mainland cities, places called Athens and Eretria that he had barely heard of, had joined the uprising and burned one of his provincial capitals. Herodotus tells us that when Darius received the news, he asked, "Who are the Athenians?" His advisors explained the Athens was a democratic city-state in mainland Greece, a naval power that had recently overthrown its own tyrant. Darius, absorbing this information, took his bow and shot an arrow into the sky, praying to the gods for the opportunity to punish Athens. Then he commanded one of his servants to remind him 3 times every day before dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." This story, whether literally true or a dramatic invention by Herodotus, captures an essential truth. Darius would not forget. The burning of Sardis had transformed the Ionian Revolt from a regional disturbance into a personal insult that demanded retribution. The Persians would respond with overwhelming force, and they would make examples of every city that had participated in the rebellion. But first, they had to catch the army that had committed this outrage. The Greek army was marching back toward the coast, moving through the mountainous terrain that separated Sardis from Ephesus. They were tired, hungry, and demoralized. The victory they had hoped for had turned into a Pyrrhic disaster. They had captured Sardis only to watch it burn. They had fought Persian soldiers in a burning marketplace and been driven back. And now they were retreating, having accomplished nothing except the pointless destruction of a major city. Behind them, the Persian response was already mobilizing. Artaphernes sent urgent messages to every garrison, every satrap, every military unit within reach. The rebels must not be allowed to escape unpunished. Persian forces converged on Sardis from multiple directions, officers gathering whatever troops they could muster and setting off in pursuit of the Greeks. These were not necessarily elite units. They were whoever could be assembled quickly: garrison troops, provincial levies, cavalry squadrons, whatever was available. But they were motivated, angry, and determined to avenge the insult to Persian power. The Persians caught up with the Greeks near Ephesus. The exact location is not recorded, but it was close enough to the city that the Greeks were probably hoping to reach the safety of Ephesian walls before being forced to fight. That hope died when Persian scouts reported enemy forces approaching rapidly from multiple directions. The Greeks had no choice. They had to stop, turn, and fight. The Battle of Ephesus was not a grand tactical engagement with clever maneuvers and heroic stands. It was a slaughter. The Greeks were exhausted from days of marching, disorganized from their chaotic retreat, and facing an enemy that outnumbered them and held every advantage. The Persians had cavalry, units of mounted warriors who could strike at the flanks of the Greek formation and prevent any organized retreat. The Greeks formed their hoplite phalanx, shields overlapping, spears forward, the traditional Greek battle formation that had proven so effective in other conflicts. But discipline and tactics meant nothing when soldiers were physically and mentally spent. The Persians attacked with fury. They were not just fighting to win a battle, they were exacting vengeance for Sardis, for the burned temple, for the insult to their empire. The fighting was brutal and one-sided. Greek lines broke under the Persian assault. Units that tried to retreat were cut down by cavalry. Soldiers who fought to the last were overwhelmed and killed where they stood. The Battle of Ephesus was a rout, a complete destruction of the Greek army that had dared to attack Sardis. Among the dead was Alcides, the general commanding the Eretrian contingent. His death symbolized the futility of the entire expedition. Eretria had sent 5 ships to help the Ionian cause, and now their commander's body lay on a battlefield far from home, killed in a war that had already gone terribly wrong. The Athenians fared little better. Their marines and hoplites were cut down alongside their Ionian allies. Those who survived did so only by abandoning the field and running for their lives. The survivors scattered. Ionian soldiers fled to their respective cities. The Athenians and Eretrians who managed to escape made their way back to their ships and sailed immediately for home. There would be no second expedition, no attempt to reinforce the rebellion. As far as Athens and Eretria were concerned, the Ionian cause was lost. They had sent ships and men to support what they thought would be a viable uprising against Persian tyranny. Instead, they had participated in a catastrophic failure that had accomplished nothing except to make themselves targets of Persian wrath. Aristagoras, safe in Miletus, received word of the disaster. The one offensive operation of the entire rebellion had failed completely. Sardis was destroyed but not held. The army was shattered. Athens and Eretria were withdrawing their support. The Persians were mobilizing for a full-scale counter-offensive. Everything was falling apart. But remarkably, the Ionian Revolt did not collapse immediately. Despite the disaster at Ephesus, the rebellion actually spread. The daring attack on Sardis, even though it had ended in failure, had demonstrated that Greeks could strike at Persian power. It inspired others to take up the cause, and that, paradoxically, would make the coming Persian vengeance even more terrible. In the aftermath of Ephesus, as Athens and Eretria withdrew, and the Persians began organizing their counter-offensive, something unexpected happened. Rather than collapsing, the Ionian Revolt expanded. News of Sardis had spread across the Aegean and beyond, and it carried a message that resonated with every Greek living under foreign rule. We can fight back. We can burn their cities. We can make them bleed. The Ionians sent expeditions to the Hellespont, the narrow strait connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea. This was one of the most strategic waterways in the ancient world, controlling access to the grain-rich regions around the Black Sea. Greek cities dotted both shores of the Hellespont, and many had Persian garrisons or puppet governments. The Ionian fleet sailed north and began liberating these cities one by one. Byzantium, the great city controlling the Bosporus, joined the revolt. Smaller cities along the Hellespont and the Propontis followed. Within weeks, a large stretch of the northern Aegean was in rebel hands. To the south, the region of Caria became a major theatre of the rebellion. The Carians were not Greeks, though they had been heavily influenced by Greek culture. They were a native Anatolian people with their own language, traditions, and warrior culture. They had chafed under Persian rule just as the Ionians had, and when they saw the Greeks fighting for their freedom, they decided to join. Caria was mountainous, difficult terrain where local knowledge provided enormous advantages, and where Persian cavalry, so effective on open plains, struggled to operate. The Carians would prove to be some of the toughest fighters in the entire revolt. And then, most dramatically, the island of Cyprus erupted into rebellion. Cyprus lay far to the south and east, off the coast of what is now southern Turkey and northern Syria. It was ethnically and culturally diverse, with Greek kingdoms alongside Phoenician cities. The Greek rulers of Cyprus had been watching events in Ionia with keen interest. When news arrived of the attack on Sardis, when it became clear that a serious uprising was underway, the Greek king of Salamis, named Onesilas, decided to act. Onesilas faced a problem. His own brother Gorgas was king of Salamis and was loyal to Persia. Gorgas refused to join the rebellion, arguing sensibly that Cyprus could not defeat the Persian Empire and that revolt would bring nothing but destruction. Onesilas's response was decisive and brutal. He overthrew his brother in a coup, expelled him from the city, and declared Salamis independent from Persian rule. Then he sent messengers to the other Greek kingdoms on Cyprus, urging them to join the uprising. Most did. Only the city of Amathus refused to rebel, remaining loyal to Persia. Onesilas immediately marched on Amathus and laid siege, determined to bring the entire island under rebel control before the Persians could respond. But the Persians were already responding. King Darius, furious at the spreading rebellion, ordered a systematic reconquest of every territory that had dared to revolt. He appointed 3 generals, all married to his daughters, to lead separate expeditionary forces against different rebel regions. These men were Doruses, Humays, and Otanes, members of the Persian nobility commanding the resources of a vast empire. Their orders were simple: crush the rebellion, recapture every city, and make examples of the ringleaders. The full weight of Persian military power was about to descend on the Greeks. By late 498 or early 497 BC, the Ionian Revolt had reached its maximum extent. Rebellions raged from Cyprus in the southeast to Byzantium in the northeast, from the cities of Aeolis in the north to Caria in the south. Dozens of cities had overthrown their tyrants and declared independence. Thousands of square miles of former Persian territory were now in open revolt. It looked, briefly, like the rebellion might actually succeed, but appearances were deceiving. The Greeks had no unified command, no coordinated strategy, no plan for defending their scattered territories against the coming storm. Each city was largely operating independently, pursuing its own local objectives, and marching toward them from every direction came the armies of the Persian Empire, professional soldiers commanded by experienced generals, determined to restore order through fire and blood. The empire was about to strike back, and when it did, the killing would begin in earnest. Before we continue to part 3, where the brutal Persian reconquest begins, I want to tell you about our exclusive Wars in History merchandise. We've got premium historical apparel, battlefield maps, and military history gear that lets you show your passion for the brutal truth of warfare. Check out the link in the description below and grab something epic while supplies last. Now, let's get back to the bloodshed. The year 497 BC opened with the Ionian Revolt at its maximum territorial extent. From Cyprus in the southeast to Byzantium in the northeast, dozens of Greek cities had overthrown their Persian overlords and declared independence. It looked like the rebellion might actually succeed. That illusion was about to be shattered in the most brutal way imaginable. The Persian Empire was done watching. The counter-offensive had begun. King Darius dispatched 3 separate armies to crush the rebellion simultaneously. Each force was commanded by a general married to one of Darius's daughters, men who had everything to prove and the full resources of an empire behind them. Doruses received command of the largest force with orders to reclaim the Hellespont before moving south into Caria. Humays was sent to reconquer Aeolis, the northern Ionian territories, and Otanes was assigned the Hellespont and Propontis regions. These were not exploratory expeditions. These were punitive campaigns designed to restore Persian control through overwhelming force and make examples of anyone who dared resist. But before these armies could complete their missions, urgent news arrived from Cyprus. The entire island had erupted into rebellion, and if the Persians lost Cyprus, they would lose control of the entire eastern Mediterranean. Cyprus was too important, too strategic to allow it to remain in rebel hands. The Persian response was immediate and massive. A large army and a Phoenician fleet were dispatched to recapture the island and crush the uprising before it could inspire further revolts. Onisilus of Salamis, the rebel leader who'd overthrown his own brother to join the revolt, understood what was coming. He sent desperate messages to every Ionian city begging for help. Cyprus could not stand alone against the full might of Persia. The Ionians, to their credit, responded. They gathered a substantial fleet and sailed south to Cyprus, determined to support their fellow Greeks in what everyone knew would be a decisive battle. The Persian army landed on Cyprus and marched across the island towards Salamis. The sheer size of this force forced Onisilus to abandon his siege of Amathus, the one Cypriot city that had remained loyal to Persia. He concentrated all available forces at Salamis, preparing for a battle that would determine the fate of the entire island. When the Ionian fleet arrived, Onesimus offered them a choice. They could fight on land alongside the Cypriot Greeks, or they could engage the Phoenician fleet at sea. The Ionians chose the sea. That was where their strength lay, where their triremes and experienced crews could make the difference. The Battle of Salamis in Cyprus was actually two battles fought simultaneously, one on land and one at sea, and the outcomes could not have been more different. On the water, the Ionian fleet smashed the Phoenician navy in a stunning victory. The Samians, who would later betray the entire rebellion, fought with particular distinction, their ships ramming and sinking Persian vessels throughout the engagement. The Ionians controlled the sea around Cyprus, eliminating Persian naval power in the region for years to come. It was magnificent victory, proof that Greek sailors were more than a match for Persian fleets. But on land, catastrophe unfolded. The Cypriot army took the field on the plain of Salamis, arrayed in the traditional Greek battle formation with their best troops positioned opposite the Persian centre. Onesimus personally commanded the elite forces from Salamis and Soli, and he deliberately placed himself opposite the Persian commander, a general named Artabius. This was the kind of heroic combat that Greek warriors dreamed of, champions facing each other in single combat, while armies clashed around them. Artabius rode a warhorse that had been trained for combat, a massive animal that could rear up and strike with its hooves, crushing men beneath its weight. Onesimus brought his personal squire into the fight, a man whose entire job was to deal with that horse. As the two commanders met in combat, Onesimus focused on Artabius while his squire attacked the Persian general's mount. According to Herodotus, our primary source for these events, Onesimus managed to kill Artabius in the fighting, while his squire successfully slew the warhorse. It was a moment of heroic triumph, the kind of deed that would be celebrated in poetry for generations. But elsewhere on the battlefield, treachery destroyed everything. Stesanor, the tyrant of Curium who commanded a substantial contingent of the Cypriot army, had been secretly negotiating with the Persians. At the critical moment of the battle, he turned traitor. His forces, positioned at a key point in the Cypriot line, suddenly reversed course and attacked their own allies from behind. The war chariots from Salamis, whose loyalty to Onesimus had apparently always been questionable, followed Stesanor's example and joined the Persians. The Cypriot line collapsed. What had been a hard-fought battle became a massacre. Greek soldiers found themselves surrounded, cut off, fighting enemies from multiple directions. Discipline shattered, units broke and ran. The Persians, sensing victory, pressed their attack with brutal efficiency. Onesimus, despite his personal heroism in killing the enemy commander, fell on that field. King Aristagoras of Soli died alongside him. Thousands of Cypriot Greeks were cut down as they tried to flee. The survivors scattered, many fleeing back to their cities to prepare for the siege they knew would come. The Persians had won on land, and that was what mattered. The Ionian naval victory, as spectacular as it was, could not save Cyprus. Ships could not hold territory. They could not protect cities from siege. And the Persians were experts at siege warfare. They returned Gorgas, Onesimus's brother, to power in Salamis. The people who'd supported Onesimus were purged, killed, or driven into exile. Then the Persians methodically worked their way through every Greek city on Cyprus that had dared to revolt. The sieges were brutal and professional. The Persians had generations of experience in breaking fortifications. They built massive earthen ramps up to city walls, allowing their troops to attack from height. They tunneled under fortifications, collapsing walls from below. They brought forward battering rams, enormous constructions that could hammer defensive positions until they crumbled. and they were patient, willing to starve cities into submission if necessary. The city of Soli held out for 5 months before falling. Paphos resisted until the Persians finally broke through its defences and poured into the streets. One by one, every rebel city on Cyprus fell, and with each victory the Persians demonstrated what happened to those who defied the King of Kings. The Ionians could do nothing. Their fleet, victorious at sea but unable to effect the land campaign, sailed away, leaving the Cypriots to their fate. Cyprus was reconquered, its rebellion crushed, its Greek cities brought back under Persian control through a combination of a military force and calculated terror. The first major counter-offensive of the Persian Empire had succeeded completely, and it sent a message to every other rebel city in Ionia. This is what awaits you. This is how your defiance will end. In blood, in rubble, and in chains. While Cyprus burned, the Persian general Darius led his army north to the Hellespont. This narrow strait connecting the Aegean to the Black Sea was one of the most strategic waterways in the ancient world, and the Greek cities controlling both shores had joined the Ionian Revolt. They had overthrown their tyrants, expelled Persian garrisons, and declared themselves free. Darius's mission was simple: take it all back. He moved with methodical precision. Darius was not interested in dramatic gestures or risky assaults. He was conducting a systematic reconquest, approaching each rebel city with overwhelming force, offering them one chance to surrender, and then crushing them when they refused. His army besieged Dardanus, a city controlling the southern entrance to the Hellespont. The siege was over in a single day according to Herodotus. Either the city surrendered immediately, or the Persians overwhelmed its defences so quickly that resistance collapsed within hours. Either way, Dardanus fell, and Darius moved on to the next target. Abydos fell in a day. Percote fell in a day. Lampsacus fell in a day. Paesus fell in a day. This was not glorious combat. This was industrial-scale military occupation, a professional army processing rebel cities like a machine, crushing each one and moving immediately to the next. The local populations had no answer to Persian siege equipment, Persian discipline, and Persian numbers. Within weeks, every Greek city in the Hellespont that had dared to revolt was back under Persian control. But then, Darius received urgent news. Caria had revolted. The Carians, those fierce indigenous Anatolian warriors, had risen up against Persian rule and were threatening the entire southern flank of the reconquest. Darius immediately abandoned his systematic reduction of Hellespont cities and marched his army south. Caria was more dangerous than a few Greek coastal cities. It was mountainous, defensible terrain where local knowledge provided enormous advantages. And the Carians had a well-deserved reputation as tough, stubborn fighters. Darius would need his entire army to crush this uprising. Meanwhile, Himaeus was conducting his own campaign in Aeolis and the Troad, the northwestern territories of the revolt. Like Darius, he moved from city to city, besieging and capturing rebel strongholds. Atarneus fell, Mytilene fell. The pattern was the same: overwhelming force, professional siege work, and the complete restoration of Persian authority. The rebels had no unified command, no coordinated defence, no way to concentrate their forces against these Persian armies. Each city fought alone and fell alone, and then Himaeus died. Herodotus does not record how or where, just that the Persian general perished during his campaign in the Troad. Perhaps he was killed in battle, perhaps disease took him, a common killer of armies operating in unfamiliar territory. Whatever the cause, his death temporarily disrupted the Persian reconquest in the north. But the machine did not stop. Other commanders took over. The sieges continued. The rebellion was being methodically dismantled city by city. The Carian Revolt represented the single greatest military threat to the Persian reconquest. The Carians were not Greek colonists trying to hold coastal cities. They were indigenous warriors fighting in their own homeland, in mountains they knew intimately, with a cultural tradition of fierce independence. They had watched the Ionian Revolt with interest, and when they saw Greeks burning Sardis and fighting Persian armies, they decided their moment had come. Caria rose in rebellion, and suddenly the Persians faced a serious military challenge. Darius, commanding the largest Persian army in the region, marched south from the Hellespont to crush the Carian uprising. He was confident, perhaps overconfident. His army had taken city after city in the Hellespont without serious resistance. He commanded thousands of professional soldiers, cavalry units, and all the resources of the Persian military machine. The Carians were mountain tribesmen. How long could they hold out? The Carians gathered their forces at a place called the White Pillars, near the Marsyas River, a tributary of the Maeander. This was their country, their land, and they knew every hill, every valley, every path through the mountains. A military advisor named Aristagoras, a relative of the king of Cilicia, allegedly suggested an aggressive tactic. He proposed that the Carians should cross the river and fight with their backs to the water. This would prevent retreat, making the warriors fight with desperate courage, because running away would mean drowning in the river. It was a bold suggestion, the kind of tactic that could turn ordinary soldiers into fanatics willing to fight to the death. The Carians rejected this idea. They chose instead to make the Persians cross the river to attack them. This gave the Carians the defensive position, allowed them to control the ground, and meant the Persians would have to attack uphill from a river crossing. It was the more conservative military choice, trading desperate courage for tactical advantage. The Battle of the Marsyas River was brutal. The Persians crossed under fire, formed their battle lines on the opposite bank, and attacked uphill into waiting Carian forces. The Carians fought with savage determination. These were men defending their homeland, their families, their entire way of life. They knew that defeat meant subjugation, tribute, and Persian garrisons occupying their territory. So they stood their ground and traded blows with professional Persian soldiers for hours. Herodotus describes the battle as a long affair, implying that it lasted much of the day. The Carians fought obstinately, refusing to break even as Persian numbers began to tell. But eventually, weight of numbers crushed courage. The Persian army was simply too large, too well equipped, too professional. The Carian line began to crack. Men who had fought for hours with spears and shields finally broke under the relentless pressure. The retreat turned into a rout. Carian warriors fled into the mountains, pursued by Persian cavalry cutting down stragglers. The casualties were horrific. Herodotus reports that 10,000 Carians died in that battle. Even accounting for ancient exaggeration, that number suggests a massacre, thousands of men cut down in a single afternoon. The Persian losses were also substantial. Herodotus claims 2,000 Persian dead, which for a victorious army indicates just how hard the Carians had fought. This was not a one-sided slaughter. This was a grinding, bloody battle that left corpses stacked across the battlefield and turned the Marsyas River red. But the Carians did not surrender. Defeated but not destroyed, they withdrew deeper into the mountains and began planning their next move. They understood they could not meet the Persians in open battle again. The numbers were too lopsided. They needed a different approach. They needed to use the advantages of terrain, of local knowledge, of guerrilla tactics. They needed to lure the Persians into a trap. After the victory at the Marsyas River, Doris began the methodical work of reducing Carian strongholds. His army moved through the countryside, besieging fortified positions, burning villages, and systematically breaking Carian resistance. It was slow, brutal work, but it was effective. The Persians were winning, and that's when the Carians struck. The Carians gathered in secret and planned an ambush. They chose a location near Pedasus, a fortified town in mountainous territory. The road to Pedasus passed through terrain perfect for ambush, narrow paths where a large army would be strung out and vulnerable. The Carians hid their forces in the hills, waited for the Persians to enter the killing zone, and then attacked with devastating effect. The Battle of Pedasus was fought at night, which added to the chaos and confusion. The Persians, confident after their victory at the Marsyas River, were not expecting an attack. They may have been marching in column rather than in battle formation. Their scouts may have been inadequate in the darkness. Whatever the specific tactical situation, the result was catastrophic for the Persians. The Carians poured out of the hills and fell upon the Persian army like a thunderbolt. In the darkness, the Persians could not form proper battle lines. Units were separated, confused, fighting enemies they could barely see. The Carians, fighting in familiar territory, moved through the darkness with confidence, striking at vulnerable points in the Persian column. The battle was a slaughter. Persian units dissolved in panic. Soldiers ran blindly in the darkness and were cut down. The proud army that had crushed the Carians at the Marsyas River was being annihilated in the mountains of Pedasus. Doris, the Persian general who had conquered the entire Hellespont in a matter of weeks, died that night. The other Persian commanders with him also fell, cut down in the chaos of the ambush. The entire Persian army was destroyed. It was a complete disaster, a catastrophe that sent shockwaves through the Persian military establishment. The seemingly invincible Persian war machine had been stopped cold by mountain tribesmen fighting on their own ground. The disaster at Pedasus created a stalemate. The Persians could not advance into Caria without risking another ambush. The Carians could not drive the Persians out entirely, but had proven they could make any occupation hideously expensive. For the remainder of 496 BC and much of 495 BC, the land campaign in Caria ground to a halt. Neither side had the strength to deliver a knockout blow, but the stalemate would not last forever. The Persians would regroup, bring in fresh armies, and eventually crush Carian resistance through sheer weight of numbers. The victory at Pedasus had bought time, but it had not won the war. Still, it was a stunning achievement. A Persian army commanded by one of Darius's sons-in-law had been completely annihilated. It was proof that the Persians could be beaten, that they were not invincible, that determined resistance could achieve victory. That lesson would not be forgotten when Persian armies eventually marched into mainland Greece years later. While the land campaigns raged through Cyprus, the Hellespont and Caria, the architect of the entire rebellion was conspicuously absent from the fighting. Aristagoras, the man whose failure at Naxos had triggered this catastrophe, the man who had overthrown the tyrants and declared democracy, was safe in Miletus, watching his rebellion slowly crumble. By 496 BC, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Athens and Eretria had withdrawn their support after the disaster at Ephesus. They wanted nothing more to do with a losing cause. Cyprus had fallen back under Persian control. The Hellespont was reconquered. Caria was fighting desperately but was clearly losing. The Persians were methodically crushing the rebellion, and everyone knew that once they finished with the outlying regions, they would concentrate their full strength against the heartland of Ionia. Miletus would be their primary target. and Aristagoras, sitting in that doomed city, understood that he was a dead man. So Aristagoras did what he had always done. He ran. He called a council of advisers to discuss what should be done. Hecataeus, the geographer who had argued against the revolt from the beginning, offered practical advice. They should seize the treasures of the temple of Apollo at Didyma and use that wealth to hire mercenaries and build more ships. It was sacrilege, stealing from a sacred temple, but these were desperate times. With money, they could hire professional soldiers. With more ships, they could maintain control of the sea. There was still a chance, however slim. Aristagoras rejected this advice. Instead, he proposed abandoning Ionia entirely. He suggested that the Milesians should evacuate their city, take their portable wealth, and sail away to found a new colony somewhere beyond Persian reach. Sardinia was mentioned as a possible destination, far away in the western Mediterranean where Persian power could never follow. It was an astonishing proposal. The man who had started this rebellion, who had convinced thousands to overthrow their rulers and fight for freedom, was now proposing to abandon them all and flee to safety. The Milesians, to their credit, refused. They were not going to abandon their homes, their temples, their ancestral lands because Aristagoras was afraid. But Aristagoras did not stay to argue. He gathered his personal supporters, commandeered ships, and sailed away from Ionia. He went north to Thrace, to the wild lands beyond Persian control, where he hoped to establish a new settlement and escape the consequences of his disastrous decisions. It did not work. Aristagoras arrived in Thrace and attempted to found a colony near the Strymon River, but the local Thracian tribes did not appreciate Greek colonists settling in their territory. They attacked the settlement, and in the fighting, Aristagoras was killed. The man who had ignited the Ionian Revolt, who had convinced Athens to send ships, who had burned Sardis and set the Greek and Persian worlds on a collision course, died in an obscure skirmish in barbarian lands, killed by tribesmen who probably had no idea who he was or what he had done. It was an inglorious end for the architect of one of history's most consequential rebellions. Meanwhile, far to the east in Susa, Histiaeus had finally convinced King Darius to let him return to Ionia. His argument was persuasive. He had been trapped in Susa while his son-in-law Aristagoras had started a rebellion. Histiaeus claimed that if he were allowed to return to Miletus, he could use his influence to end the revolt peacefully, saving Persian lives and treasure. Darius, perhaps hoping that Histiaeus could indeed bring the rebellion to a swift conclusion, agreed to let him go. But when Histiaeus arrived in Sardis, Artaphernes was not fooled for a second. The satrap looked at Histiaeus and said, "I will tell you how matters stand. You stitched the shoe that Aristagoras has put on." Artaphernes knew that Histiaeus had been one of the original instigators of the revolt, that the secret message tattooed on the messenger's head had encouraged Aristagoras to rebel. Histiaeus was not coming to end the uprising. He was coming to take advantage of it. Histiaeus fled from Sardis before Artaphernes could arrest him. He went to Chios, where the population initially imprisoned him on suspicion that he was a Persian agent. Eventually he convinced them that he was genuinely opposed to Persia and was released. From Chios, Histiaeus attempted to return to Miletus, claiming that as the rightful ruler he could lead the city's defence against the coming Persian assault. The Milesians, who had seen what happened when Histiaeus' schemes went wrong, refused to let him in. They had overthrown tyranny. They were not going to welcome back their former tyrant, no matter what he promised. Desperate and increasingly isolated, Histiaeus turned to piracy. He gathered a small fleet of ships from Lesbos and began raiding merchant vessels in the waters around Ionia. He was no longer a ruler, no longer a statesman, no longer even a respected general. He was a pirate attacking ships for plunder, barely surviving on the margins of the conflict he had helped create. In 493 BC, Histiaeus and his pirate crew were conducting a foraging expedition near the town of Malene, looking for food and supplies. A Persian force under the command of a general named Harpagus intercepted them. The ensuing battle was hard fought, but the Persians had cavalry, and a well-timed cavalry charge broke the Greek line. Histiaeus' forces scattered. Histiaeus himself was captured alive. He was brought before Artaphernes in Sardis, the satrap he had tried to deceive. Histiaeus apparently believed that even now, after everything, he could talk his way out of trouble. He thought that Darius, remembering his past service at the Danube River, would pardon him if given the chance. Artaphernes understood this possibility. He also understood that Darius might indeed forgive Histiaeus, might welcome him back, might even restore him to power. The king could be sentimental about old loyalties. Artaphernes was not going to allow that to happen. He had Histiaeus impaled, executed in one of the most brutal methods the ancient world had devised. The former tyrant of Miletus, the schemer who had helped start the Ionian Revolt, died screaming on a stake. Artaphernes then had Histiaeus' head cut off, preserved, and sent to King Darius in Susa. When Darius received the head of Histiaeus, he was reportedly angry at Artaphernes for executing him. The king still believed that Histiaeus had been loyal, that circumstances had forced him into rebellion, that he deserved a chance to explain himself. Darius ordered that Histiaeus' head be washed, properly prepared, and given an honourable burial. It was a strange end for a man whose schemes and ambitions had helped trigger a war that would rage for decades. Honoured in death by the king whose empire he had betrayed, but dead nonetheless, executed by a satrap who understood that some men are too dangerous to leave alive. By 494 BC, 6 years into the revolt, the Persians had regrouped completely. Cyprus was conquered. The Hellespont was under control. Caria, despite its heroic resistance, was being systematically pacified. The outlying regions of the rebellion had been crushed. Now it was time to strike at the heart. The Persians assembled a massive combined force, bringing together land armies and a fleet supplied by the resubjugated Cypriots, along with ships from Egypt, Cilicia, and Phoenicia. This armada, numbering hundreds of ships and tens of thousands of soldiers, pointed directly at Miletus, the city that had started the revolt, the symbolic centre of the entire rebellion. The Ionians understood what was coming. They held a council of all the cities still in revolt and made a crucial decision. They would not try to defend every city individually. That would just allow the Persians to defeat them in detail, crushing each city one by one. Instead, they would concentrate their forces. The land defences of Miletus would be left to the Milesians themselves, who had strong walls and could hold out for months if necessary. All available naval forces from every Ionian city would gather to defend Miletus by sea. If they could win the naval battle, if they could destroy or cripple the Persian fleet, they could cut off the besiegers and turn the siege into a trap for the Persians. The Ionian fleet gathered at Lade, a small island just off the coast near Miletus. This island provided an excellent anchorage and a strategic position from which to intercept any Persian naval assault on the city. The combined Ionian fleet was substantial. Miletus contributed 80 ships, Preen provided 12, Meus contributed 3, Teos sent 17. Chios, the largest naval power in Ionia, brought an enormous contingent of 100 ships. Erythrae contributed 8, Phocaea provided 3. Lesbos sent 70 ships. Samos, another major naval power, brought 60 ships. In total, the Ionian fleet numbered approximately 353 warships. It was the largest naval force the Ionians had ever assembled, a fleet that represented the combined maritime strength of a dozen cities. The Persians arrived with approximately 600 ships. They outnumbered the Ionians nearly 2-1, but numbers were not everything in naval warfare. Greek triremes were fast and maneuverable. Greek crews were experienced sailors, and the Greeks were fighting for their survival, their freedom, their homes. The Persians might have more ships, but the Ionians had motivation and skill. The Ionian commanders appointed Dionysius of Phocaea as overall naval commander. Dionysius was an experienced officer, and he immediately recognized the challenge they faced. The Ionian crews were not professional sailors. Many were civilians pressed into service, merchants and fishermen given weapons and told to fight. They lacked training, lacked discipline, lacked the cohesion necessary to execute complex fleet maneuvers under combat conditions. Dionysius instituted a brutal training regimen. Every day the fleet rowed out from Lade, practiced battle formations, conducted mock ramming attacks, drilled until the crews were exhausted. It was necessary. It might be the only thing that could give them a chance against the massive Persian fleet. But the Ionian crews hated it. They were tired, hot, and miserable. They had not signed up to be professional soldiers. They wanted to get this over with, to fight the battle, and either win their freedom or die trying. This constant drilling, this endless practice in the burning sun was wearing them down. Morale began to deteriorate. Men muttered that Dionysius was a tyrant, that the training was pointless, that they should just attack the Persians now and have done with it. The Persians saw this deteriorating morale, and they exploited it brilliantly. They still had the old tyrants, the puppet rulers who had been overthrown at the start of the rebellion. These men were brought forward and sent to the Ionian fleet with messages. The tyrants addressed contingents from their home cities with offers. Surrender now, abandon the fight, and you will be treated leniently. Your property will be respected. Your lives will be spared. The Persians just want order restored. There is no need for more bloodshed. But if you fight and lose, you will be destroyed. Your cities will be burned. Your men will be killed. Your women and children will be enslaved. Choose wisely. At first, all the contingents rejected these offers. They had come too far, sacrificed too much to surrender now. But the psychological warfare continued. The Persian offers kept coming. The training kept exhausting the crews. And slowly doubt began to creep in. What if they could not win? What if this desperate gamble failed? Wouldn't it be better to accept the offered terms, to go home and at least survive, rather than die in a hopeless battle? The Samians began secret negotiations with the Persians. Samos had contributed 60 ships to the Ionian fleet, a substantial contingent. The Samian commanders looked at the massive Persian fleet, looked at the exhausted Ionian crews, and calculated that the battle was already lost. Better to save their city, save their people, and switch sides before the fighting started. The Persians, delighted to have potential traitors within the enemy fleet, promised the Samians generous terms. When the battle began, the Samians would pull their ships out of the line and sail away. In exchange, Samos would be spared the brutal reconquest inflicted on other rebel cities. The battle began with both fleets advancing toward each other across the water. The Ionians formed their battle line, ships arrayed in formation, oars rhythmically striking the water as they moved forward to meet the enemy. The Persians came on in their superior numbers, confident that weight of ships would crush the rebels, and then, just as the fleets were about to collide, the Samians hoisted their sails and turned away. 60 ships, a massive portion of the Ionian fleet, simply abandoned the battle and sailed for home. The Ionian line collapsed into chaos. Seeing the Samians flee, other contingents panicked. The Lesbians, positioned next to the Samians in the line, saw the gap opening beside them and decided that staying to fight was suicide. They too turned and fled. The carefully planned fleet formation dissolved. Ships began peeling away, captains deciding independently that the battle was lost, and they should save their crews while they still could. But not everyone ran. The Chians, that contingent of 100 ships representing the largest single city contribution to the fleet, refused to abandon the fight. These were men from Chios, a proud naval power that had sent the most ships of any Ionian city. They had come to fight for freedom, and they would not run away, no matter how hopeless the situation appeared. The Chians attacked the Persian fleet with desperate fury. The fighting was savage. Chian triremes rammed Persian ships, smashing through hulls, sinking vessels, killing enemy sailors by the hundreds. The Persians tried to surround and isolate the remaining Ionian ships, but the Chians fought with such ferocity that they inflicted terrible casualties. Ship after ship was lost, crews drowning or being cut down in the water, but the Chians kept fighting. They would not surrender. They would not flee. They would die before they accepted defeat. Eventually, with most of their ships destroyed or crippled, the surviving Chians broke off and fled north. They beached their ships on the southern slopes of Mount Mycale and attempted to march home overland. But they entered Ephesian territory, and there they met disaster of another kind. The Ephesians, either mistaking them for bandits or seizing an opportunity to settle old rivalries, attacked the exhausted Chian survivors. The men who had fought so bravely at Lade, who had refused to abandon their comrades, who had inflicted heavy losses on the Persian fleet, were massacred by their fellow Greeks on the road home. It was a bitter, ugly end for the heroes of Lade. A few Ionian ships fought alongside the Chians until the end. 11 Samian ships refused to follow their city's betrayal and stayed in the battle, their captains deciding that honour mattered more than survival. Later, the names of the crews of those 11 ships were inscribed on a stone column in Samos's town square, a memorial to men who had chosen principle over expedience. But it was not enough. The Battle of Lade was a catastrophic defeat. The Ionian fleet was destroyed. The sea belonged to Persia, and Miletus, the city that had started this entire rebellion, was now isolated, surrounded, and doomed. With the Ionian fleet destroyed, the Persians turned their full attention to Miletus. The city's walls were strong, its defences well maintained, and its population was determined. The Miletians had known this moment was coming for years. They had watched the Persian reconquest grind through Cyprus, the Hellespont, and Caria. They had sent their ships to Lade and watched them be destroyed. Now they stood alone, and they prepared to sell their lives as dearly as possible. The Persians brought the full weight of their siege expertise to bear. They constructed massive earth ramps leading up to the walls, artificial hills that would allow their troops to attack from the same height as the defenders. They dug tunnels under the fortifications, attempting to collapse sections of wall from below. They brought forward enormous battering rams, siege engines that hammered defensive positions day after day until the stone began to crack. And they simply waited, maintaining the siege, cutting off all supplies, starving the city slowly while their engineers worked on breaking the defences. The siege lasted into 493 BC. For months the Milesians held out, defending their walls, sortying against Persian siege works, fighting with the desperate courage of people who knew exactly what awaited them if they surrendered. But they were alone. No reinforcements were coming. No relief force would break the siege. The other Ionian cities were either already conquered or too weak to help. Miletus stood alone against the largest empire on earth. Eventually, inevitably, the defences failed. Whether it was the siege ramps finally reaching the walls, or tunnels collapsing fortifications, or simply sections of wall hammered into rubble by months of battering rams, the Persians broke through. Their soldiers poured into Miletus like a flood of vengeance. What followed was not a battle, it was retribution. This was the city that had started the rebellion. This was where Aristagoras had held his council and decided to rebel. This was the symbolic heart of resistance that had cost Persia years of warfare and thousands of lives. The Persians were here to make an example. Most of the men of Miletus were killed, not executed after capture, but hunted through the streets and cut down wherever they were found. The Persians were not interested in taking prisoners, not interested in mercy. They wanted blood. The women and children were enslaved, chains fastened around their necks before they were marched away to be sold in slave markets across the empire, or distributed to Persian soldiers as spoils of war. The city itself was looted and burned. Buildings that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash. The great commercial port that had been one of the wealthiest cities in Ionia was systematically destroyed. The Persians also burned the temple of Apollo at Didyma, one of the most sacred sites in Ionia. This was payback for Sardis, for the temple of Cybele that had burned 6 years earlier. The Persians were demonstrating that they remembered every insult, every attack, every act of rebellion. They would repay it all in blood and fire. The temple treasures were looted, the sacred precincts violated, and the structures burned to the ground. It was calculated sacrilege, designed to break the spirit of any Greek still contemplating resistance. When the killing finally ended, when the fires burned out and the smoke cleared, Miletus was gone. Not conquered, not occupied, but obliterated. The population was dead or enslaved. The city was rubble. The great harbour was empty of ships. Miletus had been erased as a functioning city, destroyed so thoroughly that it would take generations to rebuild. The message was clear. This is what happens when you rebel against Persia. This is the price of defiance. News of Miletus's fall reached Athens in 493 BC. The playwright Phrynichus wrote a tragedy called The Capture of Miletus and staged it in the Athenian theatre. The audience, watching the drama unfold on stage, seeing the suffering of a city they had tried to help, broke down, weeping. The performance was so emotionally devastating that the Athenians fined Phrynichus 1,000 drachmas for reminding them of their failure, and passed a law that the play could never be performed again. They could not bear to be reminded of what their 20 ships had helped trigger, of how their brief intervention had contributed to this catastrophe. With Miletus destroyed, Carian resistance collapsed. The Carians had fought heroically, had won stunning victories like Pedasus, but they could not stand alone against the full weight of Persian military power. The Persians methodically reconquered the region, capturing strongholds, burning villages, and restoring order through overwhelming force. By 493 BC, Caria was back under Persian control. The last holdouts were the cities of the western coast that had managed to avoid direct assault during the years of fighting. Artaphernes and Otanes, commanding the Persian forces, worked their way up the coast, systematically capturing each remaining rebel city. Most surrendered without a fight. They had seen what happened to Miletus. They had no desire to share that fate. The cities opened their gates, accepted their returning tyrants or new Persian governors and submitted to Persian authority. But the Persians had learned lessons from the revolt. They understood that tyranny, the system of puppet rulers that they had relied on before, had helped cause the rebellion. The tyrants had been unpopular, resented, and easily overthrown. So Artaphernes instituted reforms. He ordered that disputes between Ionian cities be settled through arbitration rather than warfare, reducing local conflicts. He conducted a survey of Ionian territories and established fixed tribute assessments, preventing governors from extracting excessive taxes. He did not restore democracy, but he created a less oppressive occupation, one designed to prevent future rebellions by addressing some of the grievances that had fueled this one. By the end of 493 BC, the Ionian Revolt was over. It had lasted 6 years. It had spread from Cyprus to Byzantium, involving dozens of cities and hundreds of thousands of people. It had seen stunning victories like Pedasus and crushing defeats like Lade. It had cost tens of thousands of lives, destroyed multiple cities, and reshaped the political landscape of the entire Aegean. And in the end, it had accomplished nothing. The rebels were defeated. Persia retained control of Ionia. The tyrants who had not been killed were restored to power. The dream of freedom was crushed under Persian boots, but the revolt had consequences that would echo for decades. King Darius had not forgotten the Athenians. Those 20 ships that Athens had sent to help the rebels, those marines who had marched on Sardis and burned the city, those were acts of war. Athens had attacked Persian territory, had destroyed a provincial capital, had killed Persian citizens. That demanded vengeance. Darius ordered his servant to remind him 3 times every day, "Master, remember the Athenians." It was not just about punishing Athens. It was about sending a message to every Greek city-state. You cannot attack Persia and escape consequences. You cannot burn our cities and hide behind the sea. We will come for you. We will cross the Aegean, land on your shores, and make you pay for what you have done. In 492 BC, less than 2 years after the fall of Miletus, Darius sent his son-in-law Mardonius with an army and fleet to begin the subjugation of mainland Greece. That expedition met disaster when a storm destroyed much of the Persian fleet off the peninsula of Athos. But Darius did not give up. In 490 BC, he sent another expedition, this one commanded by Datis and Artaphernes the Younger, with specific orders to punish Athens and Eretria for their role in the Ionian Revolt. Eretria, which had sent 5 ships to help the Ionians, was betrayed from within. Persian agents bribed members of the city government to open the gates. The Persians captured Eretria, enslaved its population, and burned the city in deliberate parallel to what had happened to Sardis. Then they crossed to mainland Greece and landed at Marathon, a coastal plain northeast of Athens, where they would finally face the Athenians in open battle. The Battle of Marathon in 490 BC was the direct consequence of the Ionian Revolt. The Persians were there because Athens had sent ships to Ionia. The subsequent invasions of Xerxes in 480 BC, the battles of Thermopylae and Salamis and Plataea, the entire series of conflicts we call the Greco-Persian Wars, all of it traced back to one desperate tyrant's decision to rebel in 499 BC. Aristagoras, in his panic after the failure at Naxos, had set in motion events that would shape the course of Western civilization. The Ionian Revolt failed completely in its immediate objectives. It did not free Ionia from Persian control. It did not overthrow tyranny. It did not establish lasting democracies in the Greek cities of Asia Minor. Instead, it brought destruction, death, and renewed subjugation. but it also demonstrated that Persians could be beaten. The victories at Cyprus, at Pedasus, the burning of Sardis, these showed that the empire was not invincible. Greek hoplites could defeat Persian infantry, Greek ships could sink Persian fleets, and that knowledge, that understanding that Persia could be resisted, would sustain the Greeks through the invasions that followed. When the Athenians stood on the field of Marathon facing a Persian army, they remembered Sardis. When the Spartans marched to Thermopylae, they remembered Pedasus. When the Greek fleet assembled at Salamis, they remembered Lade and vowed not to repeat its betrayal. The Ionian Revolt was a disaster, but it was the disaster that taught the Greeks how to fight Persia. It was the school where they learned the brutal truth that freedom is purchased with blood, that empires can be resisted, and that, sometimes, even a doomed rebellion can change the course of history. The revolt had ended in fire and slavery, but the war it started would rage for decades and would ultimately save Western civilization from being absorbed into the Persian Empire. This was the spark that ignited an empire-ending conflict. This was where it all began. So there it is, the complete, unvarnished story of the Ionian Revolt. 6 years of warfare that achieved nothing except to set the stage for one of the most important conflicts in human history. Aristagoras gambled everything on a desperate rebellion and lost. Miletus burned. Thousands died or were enslaved. The Persians crushed the revolt with brutal efficiency and then turned their attention to mainland Greece, determined to punish Athens for daring to interfere in their empire. This was not a glorious uprising. This was not a heroic fight for freedom that ended in victory. This was a catastrophe born from one man's cowardice, an ambition, a revolt that dragged an entire region into a war they could not win, and a tragedy that demonstrated the true cost of defying the largest empire on earth. But it was also the moment that taught the Greeks how to fight Persia. It was the school where they learned that Persian armies could be ambushed, Persian fleets could be defeated, and Persian power could be resisted. When Marathon came, when Thermopylae and Salamis came, when the survival of Greece hung by a thread, the lessons of the Ionian Revolt saved Western civilization. The Greeks knew that Persia could be beaten because they had seen it happen, even in defeat. The Ionian Revolt was a disaster that paved the way for Greek victory. It was the war before the war, the spark that lit the fire, the brutal truth behind the birth of the Greco-Persian Wars. If you made it to the end of this brutal journey through one of history's most consequential rebellions, then you're exactly the kind of person who should support Wars in History on Patreon. For as little as a few dollars a month, you get early access to videos, behind-the-scenes content, exclusive deep dives into historical topics, and your name in the credits as someone who keeps this channel going. The link is in the description below. Join our community of history fans who love the brutal truth of warfare, and if you want more epic content like this, check out our video on the Battle of Marathon, where Athens faces the Persian vengeance that the Ionian Revolt triggered. Thanks for watching, and remember, history is written in blood.